And here we are, once again.
Hello and welcome to Token Affairs, episode 4.
Episode 4. Wow, they're coming in quick.
Just churning them away. I'm proud to introduce my co-host and the producer of the show, Trevor. He is CEO and founder of
Avatars
Global. Sorry, had coffee not kicking in. Avatars Global and executive director of Blockchain New Zealand. I'm a partner at Hamilton Locke New Zealand, specializing in crypto and fintech.
And also
we have an amazing guest.
Yes.
Also vice chair of Blockchain New Zealand.
You are. Yes, today is a big one. We've been looking forward to this one. I think, we kicked off episode 1 with Jason Titman, who is the man in the hottest seat in our region right now, I think, or certainly in the ANZ jurisdiction. I think Jason's in the hottest seat. But if there was a guy that's in the hottest seat in APAC, it's our guest today. This is a guy that needs very little introduction if you've been in the blockchain industry and you live in this part of the world. But for those who are tuning in and don't know who Steve is arguably the most connected, certainly the most well-traveled, and tends to be in every place with his finger on the pulse. We were just joking backstage about how Bryan and I tend to be standing in the queue outside the club waiting to be let in, where Steve tends to just flash his badge and go straight past the bouncer with the 2 blondes on his arm. So without mucking around too much, getting into the point, let's introduce Steve and bring him on. So our guest today, Steve Vallas, is the founder and CEO of Blockchain APAC and was the former CEO of Blockchain Australia. Steve also sits on the APAC policy advisor for the Global Blockchain Business Council. So really is probably the most highest positioned advocate for blockchain and the sector across APAC. So please make welcome. Crowd go crazy, slap your keyboards, smack your cameras, pour your beers out for the man himself. Welcome to the stage, Steve Vallas. How are you, mate?
I'm great. That introduction makes me concerned that this face for radio will be a problem for those who are tuning into the visual reflection and depiction of this little interview.
Yeah.
You're always so humble, Steve. So super excited to have you on the show. You have so much alpha to share. You've traveled probably half the world in the past several months. Would love to just really deep dive into what you've learned from your trips to the US, Asia, Europe, UK, and then obviously all around Australia is probably Australia's leading advocate for digital asset innovation. But before we dive into that, I think for those who aren't super familiar with you, and I'm surprised if there are any unfamiliar with you, we'd love to really get to know more about, how you got into digital assets. As Trevor would say, what was your red pill moment? And then how you've become CEO and founder of Blockchain APAC.
It's become a long story now, Bryan. It's been a while since this all started. Formal qualifications as a lawyer, was working in digital strategy, doing some work largely as a management consultant. And the moment for me was one related to privacy and one related to triangulation of data. I was at an event where people were talking about needing to know everything about me in order to sell me a pair of shoes. And I thought, I don't need the shoes that badly. And so it sort of set me on this path of paying attention to what was happening in Bitcoin and privacy enabled payments, and that was kind of the origin story for me. I kept the day job, and I think you know this, Bryan. I engaged with you over a number of years in relation to this sort of stuff. I just went to everything for a few years, actually. I kept the day job, went to nearly 300 events, I think, over the course of 2 years, built out an enormous community, and then ended up having a conversation with the peak industry body at the time who needed a little bit of help and some momentum, and effectively I reverse engineered my network into the network that the peak industry body was looking to build, and was the CEO there for a couple of years, had a lot of success, built a lot of attention and momentum for the industry and industry participants, and then handed the keys back when everything was going well. I didn't wait till the market turned. It was pre-FTX. As far as everyone was concerned, it was blue sky as far as the eye could see. And I just thought my role in the organisation had come to a natural end. There were lots of members, lots of people championing the cause. And so I thought I'd focus instead again on the things I was focusing before I became CEO, which were topics that I thought would move the needle. And so focused largely on issues around custody, payments and stablecoins, and KYC AML elements. And that's what's kept Rochelle and I busy at Blockchain APAC. You know, that interest in those subject matters just makes its way into all rooms, not just digital asset and crypto rooms. It's traditional financial service, regulatory rooms, policy rooms. And increasingly, we find that the greatest value we can deliver is by leaving the country. And we've done a lot of that in the last year or so, and we'll do a lot of it in the next year or so. We're trying to bring international experience back into Oz, Bryan. So that's the short, long version of how I got here.
That's awesome.
So your red pill moment cornered around identification and KYC stuff. I always find that, you know, it's particularly pervasive. It's just gotten way out of control. It was definitely a part of my early stage as well, so I can definitely, you know, relate to it. I remember when I started getting into blockchain, really more than sort of crypto and NFTs and all of the other sort of hype that sits above blockchain. It was all around, you know, I was applying for jobs at the time. I was going through a, you know, change in employment, and I was looking for another opportunity. And I remember having to fill in job applications, and, you know, they don't know me, I don't know them. I'm really just sending over some information about me, and they want my passport, my driver's license. You know, they want me to do a whole lot of the due diligence that they need to do on me before we've even met. And I thought, this is outrageous. This is just simply crazy. Why do you need a copy of my passport? You probably won't even make the shortlist. So there's some really unusual elements around how our data has just become so widely, it just assumes that it's so widely available to anyone and everyone now. And I think that that's a huge problem that blockchain is trying, you know, very hard to fix.
Yeah, I found the other thing that was sort of useful at the time, Trevor, that's served me well is a curiosity in relation to it. I convinced my wife we were going on a holiday. It wasn't a holiday. We went to China, went to a blockchain conference. I got her to bring her mother because it wasn't going to be a holiday because she wasn't going to see me for 3 or 4 days. And I just felt at the time that it was a really important subject matter. And, you know, Vitalik Buterin was speaking there, Nick Szabo was speaking, a bunch of, you know, original kind of participants in the space. And I sat there in a room which was 90% Chinese nationals and 10% everyone else. No one knew what was going on, and they were speaking in English. And I thought, God help the 90% of people who aren't speaking in English as a first language, because it was so confusing in English. But it stimulated and sort of spurred a curiosity. You know, I heard Vlad Zamfir talking about consensus mechanisms, and I thought I was having an aneurysm because I just couldn't follow along. And rather than go home and say, you know what, this is it, I'm done. My wife said, are you okay? You look angry. I said, I'm angry. I just don't understand what I just got told. And it bothered me enough to try to find out about it. And so that's kind of the approach I take into rooms 7, 8 years later, is at least I'm curious about it. I mean, I say to people, you don't have to agree or disagree, but maintain some curiosity. And so all those things have led to very interesting conversations in my life, professionally, some pretty extraordinary things that I didn't ever expect I would benefit from.
You talk about rooms, and, you know, Trevor and I were joking backstage about all the rooms that you've gotten into that we would never get into. You're in a special room when you're in the US when Genius and Clarity were announced as new legislation. You've been in rooms pretty much all over the world with politicians, with government agencies, regulators. We'd love to hear some of the alpha that you've got just from being in all these rooms.
Should we start in the US, Bryan? Is that's where the attention is?
Love to.
The thing that's interesting for me that I've tried to communicate over an extended period of time, and I've watched people not either sort of get it or come to this sort of realization late, it's not the headlines. You know, when people didn't care and there was barely a headline, things were still happening. Now that they care a lot and there are lots of different rooms, those headlines still don't matter. It's what's happening at the base layer, to sort of borrow some language from the sector. There's a lot of pressure that has been building up over an extended period of time, and it just wasn't being seen. And so the reason I was in the US over the last year or two was to put my ear to the ground and try to identify what that pressure was. And that pressure was not Joe Biden showing interest and the government showing interest. It was at a state level, people showing interest. It was all sorts of litigation that was happening in different quarters there. It was funds going in and out. Like, it was this build-up of pressure in a sort of tectonic plates way. The pressure was building on these different sort of parts of the ecosystem. And it was only going to be a question of when, not if, that pressure would would release. And so what happened last year was, as the trajectory was moving with more visible sort of participation by politicians, again, people saw that as the signal. That wasn't the signal. That's a late signal. That is not the alpha. By the time it gets to that point, a lot has happened. A lot of people have been convinced or confused, or they've formed a view, which is now the direction they're naturally taking. So all that was missed. And so when I chatted to people in this room, it's like, we can't see anything happening. It's like, by the time you see this thing happening, the final sign is the first sign you're likely to see. And so I was paying attention to that. So when I went to the US this year, it was very obvious that it wasn't the fact that love him or loathe him, Donald Trump was the center of attention. It was what's happening under him, alongside him, and sort of in all sorts of other parts of the machinery of government. And the truth is, there's been a shift and a change, some forced through, some natural, that's occurred, and people just hadn't placed enough stock in that. So you flash forward to a few weeks ago when I was in the US, and the conversation was not just about genius. It was all of the momentum about people redeploying capital, revisiting this subject matter. And the way I've described it generally, it's who do we want to partner up with? That's one of the things at the moment. People will say, has an organization spent the money? A precursor to spending that money is who and what and where you're going to spend that money. Those conversations are now being fully formed in the US, and the weight of investment has come. And the thing that changes, and this has been my view, generally changes people's minds, is one of two actions or activities. One is incentives. If people have an appropriate or a sufficient incentive, they'll move, or the fear of embarrassment because they missed the opportunity as it was presented to them. They're the two forces at play here. And I think, sadly, it took me a few years to realize that my previous approach, which is we're all in this together, let me just educate you towards an outcome that might give you a better opportunity, that does not work as effectively as incentive alignment and the fear of embarrassment. So I've watched all of that coalesce in the US. And so now I see a market that has decided with purpose, we're just going to go get this. And that is exactly what's happening. And I think I've been posting a variety of things on LinkedIn in recent times that reflect the fact they're trying to claim it all. This isn't a piecemeal, which part do we like? They're saying, we like it, we want it, and they're going after it. And I think we were chatting earlier, Bryan, about the AI conversation as well as an adjacent one. They'd say, we want that too. And so whilst we decide what we do and don't want, and whether it's appropriate or inappropriate, the Americans now are saying, no, we want all of the AI, we want all the digital assets, we want it, and this will be the home for it. So it's a very different world to the one that we were looking at 6 months ago, 12 months ago, 24 months ago. Isn't
it interesting, the conversation in New Zealand is, you talk about the incentives, the alignment of incentives. It's irony that you talk about now. The incentive is I don't want to be seen to not be moving on this. I don't want to be seen to be being left behind. Whereas here, nobody wants to put their hand up for fear of not knowing what they're talking about, right? So it's this fear that I don't want to be the one that ends up on the front page of the Herald saying something stupid. So I'm just not going to engage at all. How quickly that story has changed in the US to I better move and move fast, whether I understand it or not, because it's a fundamental shift, or a radical and seismic shift. I mean, we saw the same thing in the UAE, right? Like they kind of did the same thing and said, we want it all, tax free. We've got free zones that we incentivize and bring. We'll give you capital, we'll give you access to bank accounts, access to licenses for financial products, access to regulators to move quickly, and we can get you a license in 24, 48 hours if you want to, start working with a new digital asset. That's a radical approach to something, and the result is all of the industry is moving into those two jurisdictions right now. They just seem to be eating up the entire world. And in my frustration, we were talking a little bit about frustrations as well. New Zealand is the smallest, it's the wealthiest, smallest country on the planet, pretty much. So it's the size of a small, like a multinational, like a global corporation, the GDP. We should be able to make that pivot and start producing products at speed. And that should be our advantage. That should be the very thing that drives our decision making forward and drives our country to become a leader in this space. Is we can make these decisions quickly. We can enact and roll out legislation. We can create a playing field. We can create these license classes. We can do all of this work in months, not years. And yet we're in a position right now where people that just heard about this Bitcoin thing. I don't really understand it. We just shared our kind of red pill moments where you go, I don't understand what I'm talking. I've just sat and listened to a whole bunch of stuff. I have no idea what you're talking about. And instead of leading into that and going, well, this is something I need to know more about, it's this sort of reticence and this leaning away. What do you think? What about Australia? Let's go from sort of the US now back into Australia. Is it still like that in Australia? Is that still the conversation you're having there, or are you seeing a shift as a result of what's happening here?
So I'll connect the dots on what you just said, Trevor. Two observations, which is something that Australia suffers from, and I think New Zealand suffers from also. If you talk to people in our jurisdictions, they'll generally say, "What's the burning platform? What's broken?" And the reality here is, burning platforms, bridges, they don't fall over in a hurry. Usually they degrade, and over time something goes wrong, and you can maintain them as long as you like, but sometimes these things just don't work anymore, or they're not as structurally sound as they used to be. They don't accommodate as much traffic. These things require replacement, and so the notion that you've got to wait till something is a burning platform is problematic. We do it a lot, and so Australia has lots of reasonably advanced systems, but they're systems based on us being closer to the front of the pack in years gone by than it is being close to the front of the pack now. So that's one of the issues. So it's just waiting for that problem to get to that critical point. The other point, which is a jurisdictional one that ties into sort of New Zealand's place in the world and Australia's place in the world, you need to be self-aware enough to know that even if we get everything right, we still only matter to a small proportion of the world in a way that we would like to matter to that proportion of the world. And I use as an example, a lot of the jurisdictions that have otherwise been, they've been forward acting because they have to be small jurisdictions that worry about being sort of domiciled or having organisations that domicile. There's lots of competition, and historically been lots of competition around some of these markets to have your businesses domiciled offshore. Those businesses are now being honest enough, those countries are now being honest enough to say their product market fit has degraded because bigger institutions, bigger countries are all coalescing. And so it's like, hold on, what we did 3 years ago will not bring us people now. So they're sort of agitating in a way that I haven't previously seen. We're caught in the middle of that. We're not so small that we think we have to constantly be at the front of the pack, and we're not so big that we have the luxury of sitting at the rear of the pack and saying something will naturally come to us. So Australia finds itself in that situation. I think subsequent and blue team, red team governments have both promised to do a bunch, and very little has happened. And that's just the reality now. And people say it's this person's fault, it's that person. I will only judge by the comparison tools we have available to us today, which we didn't 18 months ago. I think it was really easy 18 months ago to say, well, no one's doing anything, so our position in a relative sense is okay. But what do you do in the face of the US having upended its position in a 12-month period and less? The UK is moving, MiCA's moving, Singapore has moved, Japan's moved. What in that context is your position? And we're finding ourselves dislocated, and this is something that's communicated to me in all these jurisdictions, Bryan. 2 laps of the world it was in 2 months, one in one direction, one in the other. Those who know Australia are saying, what's happening there? And not what's happening there as in let us know. It's with curiosity, what is it about this direction that can justify the way you're going, much more than what is your direction? And so that's where we're at, Trevor. People are trying to figure out whether we're going a different way to what others are going. And if we are, what would make our circumstances so unique that we would think we're okay dislocating from what are otherwise global directions in this space?
Part of my job as a lawyer is to jurisdiction shop for clients, and sometimes there are jurisdictions where the regulatory compliance just makes it a little easier to launch innovative products. You've probably got the best view of all of the jurisdictions that are leading digital asset regulation, policy, innovation. Could you give us a list of who you think are the top jurisdictions to follow?
Sure, and I can give you the shift, Bryan. And this is kind of the thing for me is part of the reason I've been traveling as much as I have and have these conversations that invariably start in the US in the morning and end up in Europe and the UK at night and everything in between that is sort of the Asian region. It's, again, a world of relativities. The trips that I've had recently have affirmed for me that Singapore has been a little bit more conservative. This is the market communication, more conservative with respect to this space. They've been much more blockchain, not crypto. That's been very deliberate. That's the MAS's focus to ensure, I think, their primary concern around retail risk is heard. So Singapore has been a little bit more conservative. Hong Kong has been more adamant that it's got a role to play. So Hong Kong has shifted. And this is a relative sense where I can say, I'm telling you what I'm seeing in the 6-month period in this year. Hong Kong up, Singapore down a little. The United Arab Emirates generally, their product market fit has been significantly improved by the US position, simply because they're not the US. They're trying to be a market that is encouraging people to co-invest, which is important because most jurisdictions need investment, not co-investment. There's not enough there in the co-invest stage. It's come and bring what you're doing to us. So the UAE has seen enormous interest, which I used to see largely out of Asia, now extend into other jurisdictions. So they're up significantly in terms of momentum. And I think in no small part due to the active competition within the UAE. Abu Dhabi and Dubai serve different purposes often. They have different conversations. They've got different regulators. So that natural competition is reflected in sort of the interest that is being drawn into it. So they're up sort of significantly. You look to the UK. The UK has been good in that it's been consistent in the last 6 to 8 months. They've said, this is the base we're coming off. There was lots of criticism that I observed firsthand when I was in London last year. In the space of 8 months, people have said, listen, we're not sure what this ultimate framework looks like, but we know something's coming. And so again, the UK has sprung back into conversations because people are saying, there's news coming, there's a framework afoot. We're not sure yet what the implications are, but we know there will be an opportunity to say, what is the UK doing, and be able to answer it. So the UK up. On the MECA side and the European side, I think because there's been more to compare, I go back a year, and a year ago people said Europe has managed to roll MECA out. This, is a very, very good thing. Compared to others, they're further ahead. I think MECA has suffered a little bit in recent times because others are now saying, hold on, there are more comparisons. Is this too expensive? Is it too cumbersome? What are the extraterritorial obligations? So I would say MECA's come off a little bit in terms of where they're at. So again, this net, which is UK up and the European Union down a little bit, is the way I'd sort of characterise it. The US is its own thing. It's so enormous, and its pull is much more what directional shifts. It's a little bit like the tides here. Whether or not you want to be impacted by it, you're going to be impacted by those tides. Are you happy to be taken out? Are you happy to be brought back in? So that's kind of the round the grounds, Bryan. And the point that was the smaller jurisdictions that are sort of the domicile jurisdictions, there's no clear winner. Like when I've been surveying people and I'll speak to them about which markets, where are you likely to potentially look to for these domicile requirements? And the answer is there's no particular answer. But you can hear names of places that were once popular, now re-emerging, and new names, new jurisdictions now popping up saying, you know what, if we are to play a part in this ecosystem, we better stake our claim now. And so that's kind of what's happening in the round the grounds way from my perspective.
That's
so
awesome.
I try and look at it, with a very commercial hat on. From my perspective, I try and think about what are the opportunities that, if we could pick a strategy, it's bottom of the ninth or whatever your analogy might be, and we pick a strategy instead of just being handed what we get, which is kind of where we're headed, right? With the way the US is gobbling everything up, whatever scraps or bits fall apart or whatever they tell us we're going to get is kind of what we're going to get. We put a commercial hat on for a second. If I was to wave a magic wand, Steve, and make you the digital assets manager for Australia or even for ANZ, where do you think the biggest opportunities are if we were to focus our attention on one part of this growing sector? Where do you think the best bet would be to lie if you were to place your bets, how we can get in front of the game or at least slice off a significant part of this market share of this enormously growing?
Yeah, I'll start at the opposite end of that. Stop trying to create use cases no one cares about. And this is one of the challenges we have as a jurisdiction. Australians would love to talk about supply chains all the time. No one talks about supply chains in the same way they talk about payments rails and the movement of value, the movement of money, and exchange. They're just not. So we can talk about supply chains, but we'll be talking to a much smaller sort of subset. So that's sort of part one of the answer is just because you find it interesting, it happens in the VC sector as well. So this is what our specialty is. You go, okay, if there's no money there, you can specialize all you like. Opportunity will not come to you. So I think that's sort of the first principle step is to say, what is it that people want to talk about, or what is it what people want to be involved in, and is it consistent with what we're saying? Because if it isn't, then you really need to reset your own expectations. I think the reality here of the jurisdictional bit, the bit that comes next, is there are certain jurisdictions that are considered safe, secure, seasoned in relation. Australia suffers from and also benefits from a conservative view. People view this as a stable jurisdiction. So the reality is you should lean in on that stability. You should say these are the regulators that are paying attention. These are the ones that if you set up in Australia, you'll benefit from. So you move one step along again. So this is a supply chain of sorts. You move to the regulators and say the regulators have to make concessions and accommodate things that mean what I just described can actually turn into a business opportunity. You need regulators to say, you know what, this doesn't fit perfectly, but we're going to have to quickly turn around what is some relief applications or some concessions that say appropriate safeguards are in place, but we're not going to do this in a very, very linear way in order to sort of figure things out. One thing, again, I'll hazard a guess on and sort of express a view on is the stablecoin situation at the moment. When everyone thinks they're a chance to create a stablecoin opportunity, then you can be sure that virtually no one will, because everyone is piling in at the same time. So if you're going to take an opportunity that is in plain sight, the question is, what is the differentiator in market? And at the moment, almost everything is US dollar backed. So if you're pegged to the US dollar, you're a good chance. At the moment, the arbitrage is, can you generate a yield and return of some description that allows people who do hold in stable coins, they can see something come back to them. That's where the arbitrage is. It isn't creating a tech stack which allows you to have a stablecoin issued in market. Everyone's doing that. You've got so many tech providers that could tell you tomorrow they can deploy a stablecoin for you. The question is, does anyone have any desire to utilize this thing? All those things and all the conditions and the issues need to be considered on the regulatory sense. Right now, momentum is around investment and momentum is around building out infrastructure for payments and associated things. It's taking what are existing pools and adding velocity and liquidity. That's where the momentum is. So right now, Trevor, that's what I would say to people. And it's a difficult thing in Australia. You have a 4-pillar banking policy. You have very, very profitable banks. There really is no need for them to move into this. I think people overstate banks are worried about this technology sort of ruining their future. Not with tens of billions of dollars in profit in Australia in the last year or so. It's not that pressing a concern for them. It's an ROI. And at the moment, they just don't see the ROI. But I think people who deploy capital, people who manage capital, they're the ones that we should be focusing in on, because their peers in jurisdictions outside Australia and New Zealand have decided there is a return available to them. And this is the asterisk. Even if they don't like the asset class, they begrudgingly acknowledge it is an asset class and there's an opportunity for people to invest in it. Just make sure they're informed, make sure they're safe, and then go ahead. So it's that disconnect that says if you don't think it's an asset class at this point in time, then I don't know what to tell you.
You make some really important insights, Steve, and I think I agree that in a competitive market, you need to really find differentiators that help you stand out, and then hopefully those differentiators can be a fast-flowing river, so to speak, to kind of you taking back market share or market lead. We were on a podcast last week with Paul Quickenden from Easy Crypto, and we made the comment that stablecoins is essentially going to power the tokenization of everything else, whether it's real-world assets, licensed IP. Where do you see, other than stablecoins, where do you see some of the other use cases that are really bearing fruit overseas?
I'm going to choose the boring one, Bryan, because the boring one is the most interesting one for most of the businesses I speak. It's just a costs out exercise. Everyone wants to reshape and reframe and disrupt. Most people's business involves saving a couple of percentage points in costs. So anything that takes costs out is where I see the momentum. The other thing on either side of that stack, which is, again, an opportunity that I'm a bit befuddled to not see people in our respective jurisdictions take on, the tools around it. I mean, it's sort of things that will give confidence to regulators, as an example, risk and compliance tools, market manipulation tools, track and trace tools. They're not growing locally. Like, you're not seeing Australian and New Zealand businesses build out for that opportunity. I go to the US and I see these businesses funded to the tune of 50, 70, $100 million. They're just creating better reg tech tools. We don't do that here. I mean, there's this grave fear about this thing that sits in between those sort of elements of this ecosystem, this terrible crypto thing that no one likes or no one understands. So let's steer clear of anything upstream or downstream. And so for me, the two most boring opportunities are people who build tooling in order to make sure this is something which can be accommodated within traditional sort of rails and adjacent to, and cost out stuff. They're the things that will get people's attention. It's the reason why at the moment you can't overcome the other great challenge in organisation, which is risk. The risk of being involved in this ecosystem currently outweighs the cost benefit of trying to take costs out or otherwise associating yourself. So that's changing, and it's changed much more quickly overseas than it has locally. And my hope is we get to at least chase. I don't know whether we actually catch now, Bryan. This is our dilemma. I don't think anyone's slowing down in order for us to catch up to that peloton. And now the question is, are they just going to ride off? And can we stay close to the back, or do we get a few moments where we say, you know what, let's commit to this? But that requires a coordination across industry, government, regulators, and a bit of luck in order for us to sort of regain and maintain relevance.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the boring stuff. It was the same in the early days of Web3. When you saw people moving into this sort of immersive internet, and how we were starting to look at the idea of ownership, which is where sort of digital assets all spawn from. It was the infrastructure layers, the people who were building the functionality layer that powers it all were the ones that are really winning. Everybody had their attention focused on the shiny, sparkly use cases, but it's just the guys who are doing the work that needs to be done that are the ones that are going to benefit from. And when I talk about how New Zealand's just going to be left with whatever we get left with, that's what I'm talking about. If we're not building these products to suit our jurisdiction, to suit our goals, and to suit our roadmap, then we're just going to have to adapt those goals, that roadmap, that idea to whatever we get handed, because no one's building it, no one's investing in it. So it's a case of here's what you've got. Choose from the US model, choose from the Chinese model, choose from the Arabic model. Take your pick. That's what you've got, because you haven't invested in it, and it's too late, as you say, too late to catch up. So I think it's a really urgent call to action right now, from a government regulatory point of view. It's not just about, we talk about taxonomies and we talk about some of the early things that we need to see in the industry, but in my mind, we need to be pouring investment into controlling and how we play in the space on a global market. Otherwise, we're just going to play along. It's like every company has to be part of the S&P 500 now. What about the NZ stock exchange or the ASX? Those things won't exist if we don't build them, if we don't start trying to create our own playing fields here.
Yeah, and from my perspective, Trevor, I don't think the sky's falling. I think there's lots of opportunities. Just fewer of them here. Yeah, that's the reality. I've never been more excited about what opportunities are being spawned. And the truth is, for people who are in New Zealand or in Australia or any jurisdiction, one, there is portability. There's the portability because you do get access to these tools. I mean, so many of them are open source, so you can build on someone else's stack. That's one thing. And the truth is the mobility. There was a period of time, obviously because of COVID, lots of Australians were locked down. We were saved by the fact notionally that the borders were so locked down you couldn't move. I think that gave us a false sense of security. People are moving. I think too early, people said the sky was falling, and it wasn't quite falling. Now, when you talk to people who have significant projects, expat Australians and other jurisdictions, sadly, they'll say, we're just not going to come back. Like, it doesn't make sense commercially to come back. And that's a criticism of lots of things and lots of people, but it's also an observation that the things that we need in order for the ecosystem to thrive aren't there. And, Bryan and I have chatted over a number of years around the startup ecosystem. Australia suffers from the fact that our startup ecosystem is state-based, largely. You have these little cohorts within states, and as much as everyone says it's for the betterment of the country, the truth is, if you've been funded by a state government to deliver outcomes, very hard to go back to that funding pool and say, oh, by the way, 80% of this benefit accrued to another state. And so you've got this insular-looking VC system. That means a lot of this energy just goes nowhere. And so it's kind of how do you do this sort of nation state style view? How do you implement it? How do you impress people? Well, you need more capital, and it's just not available for people at the moment to sort of grow what they need to do. So where do you look? You have to look to other jurisdictions.
We were talking behind the curtain about having local champions, and Steve, yourself and Rochelle organize Policy Week every year, which I love going to, and you have so many prominent and also really educated politicians from both sides of the aisle talking about quite important issues for the Australian digital assets industry. From your experience, working with politicians around the world, what kind of champions do you think New Zealand would need at a political level to help us kind of get things off the ground?
The first thing I say is you need redundancy in whatever that champion looks like, Bryan. I mean, this is one of our dilemmas. People build these relationships, they invest the time and the effort, they get people upskilled, and then politics is a brutal game. There's little prospect of the people that you start with being the people that you end with here. So it's kind of, you need to be broad, and that's a mistake I think many jurisdictions have made. Part of it is resourcing, and so when you talk about jurisdictions like the US at the moment, it's clear that it's blue team and red team, and you watch things like Genius and the stable stuff be pushed through Houses of Parliament with not equal numbers but significant numbers on both sides of the aisle, and then you see an age differential as well. So you have to appreciate one person does not traverse all of these rooms. One person can't speak to that subject matter, and by the way, if that person is not tasked with it, they're a champion without a voice. And so that's one of the things that I think New Zealand needs to do better, and Australia needs to do better. It's how many people want to speak about this, and is there a sense that this is a subject matter that penetrates the top 30, 20 and 10 topics? And that's where I think we've fallen over locally. It's been of interest and sometimes a little bit more than others, but it's been largely of passing interest. It's been just outside of that series of topics that has to be discussed. And so from my perspective, that's the thing that I'm looking at trying to bolster, is getting in front of more people. I think the New Zealand experience is chat to anyone that'll have that conversation. You don't know where people end up, you know where they start, but the reality here is it's just been too many single points of failure in relation to this. And the other thing that's a challenge for organisations like BlockchainNZ and all the associations that are present in Australia, the cost of providing a voice is significant. Even doing nothing. People always talk about the lobbying in the US, for example, how much money they put towards politicians. Save for that, take that out. It still costs a lot of money to get people to commit their time to creating thoughtful policy pieces and communicate them, and share them and maintain that momentum. All those things have a very significant cost. When I was in the UK last year and we delivered an event called the RegTech Forum, I think we had 10 associations show up, and because it's a bigger market, we had 10 associations.
Get that. Could you try again?
Well, that's my AI thinking I'm talking to it. The challenge there is they have resources, and often they still can't get outcomes. And so that's the trick here. You have to constantly find yourself in a position where you're constantly having to go back and say, we're a little bit closer to where we are. Can we find the resourcing? And I think resourcing is problematic.
Yeah, I agree.
So what's the next steps for Blockchain APAC, Steve? Like you've now got plenty of your fingers in quite a lot of pies. You sort of moving the industry forward as best you can. I know firsthand how it is to be a solo kind of practitioner in that field, and you're banging on doors and you're one voice in a very crowded and noisy room. But tell us a little bit about where you see the next 12 months. Like we're neck deep in a bull run. Market sentiment's shifting. The average consumer is waking up to Bitcoin and blockchain. The major payments providers like Stripe and those sorts of people are moving their rails on chain. What do you think the next sort of 6 to 12 months looks like for Blockchain APAC and the region?
Well, the great news for me, Trevor, is I don't run an association, and I did my time, and so 2 years and I'm out. So for me, it's just moving in the direction of conversations I think are useful ones. And it's a very different challenge for me than it is for the associations, who I have a lot of empathy for. I see different opportunities to create momentum and to benefit from momentum. And so I was away for a number of months by design. That was an accident of timing. I knew Australia had just moved into an election mode, so there was no point talking a lot to politicians and trying to move regulatory reform because they pressed pause. And so that was an opportunity to travel into other jurisdictions. The next few months for me involved trying to get a better sense of what the issues are and get people to coalesce a little bit more locally. There's a few different ways we tend to do that. We'll put together another top 50 list, which is meant to be a talking point. Who's moving things, who's not moving things, what voices matter, what voices should be surfaced. That's just an exercise in maintaining attention and interest, and then making sure that we're in rooms which are not the same rooms. The echo chamber effect from an industry perspective is problematic. clearly I'll be in New Zealand for crypto winter, and so I think there's a lot of excitement that's built for that. And I haven't been in Queenstown for a long time. I was a young man filled with hopes and dreams the last time I was in Queenstown, Trevor. So I'm looking forward to heading back there. So the next 3 months are more localized conversation, and then we shift focus again because we think once a greater sense of what the local ecosystems development looks like through consultations and draft legislation and the like, then we move into markets again we can learn from. So Rochelle and I will be traveling into Singapore, back to the US. We'll be heading to Abu Dhabi at the end of the year, and then back into Hong Kong next year. So it's this very deliberate sort of push-pull of local conversations to try to galvanize views and to get people to have a sort of a broader discussion about what this might mean, and then amplifying that going into other jurisdictions and doing what people don't do enough, which is you have to be on the ground in these places. We like to offer up views about what others are doing, and rarely do we leave our own shores. It just helps when you're sitting across from people, and they'll say, here's what the headline says, here's what the article should have said, here's what the reality is, and here's my laments or my opportunities. So those things are rarely able to be communicated unless you're sitting across from people.
Yeah, nice. Well, I'm sure that you'll be bringing a very, very well-received amount of alpha, amount of input and perspective for the crypto winter audience. I was having
absolutely.
I was having a conversation with another ED from another organisation as part of NZ Tech earlier today, and they're asking me, what are they're new to the role, so they're asking me a little bit about, what do I find to be important, and I said, you've got to get out and go and. The most important time I've spent so far in this role was Policy Week, your event in March. That was a real, that peeled my eyeballs back.
Yep.
In no uncertain terms, I came out of that just with a whole different perspective of what I should be doing and how I should be doing it. Deconference again, similar sort of thing. Making those connections, building those networks. Without those sorts of events and without getting outside of your little circle, you can't create the type of momentum that you're talking about. You can't create those relationships that actually shift the needle forward. You can't bring those sorts of perspectives into light. You can read and listen to all the blogs you want, but you've got to really be on the ground, shaking people's hands and building those relationships and those networks in order to pull it off. So first and foremost, a massive thank you from me, because we wouldn't be where we are without your input, your involvement, and your advocacy around the region.
Thank you.
So you're a huge influence on what we do and where we're headed. So can't wait to see what you bring to Crypto Winter next week. Very excited to have you on the ground there, and I know there's a couple of people. You've helped me sell a few tickets, mate. So I'll probably owe you a beer or two as well.
That's it. I'm much shorter in real life, and I'll need to get a haircut. So I'll try to spruce up this old car a little bit, so I look a little bit more impressive IRL.
Yeah, Steve, we could probably go on for another 2 hours easily. We've only really just scratched the surface of your knowledge, your insights, and your experience traveling the world. I've said it many times that Steve is the connective tissue for global digital asset policy and regulation, and Steve, no doubt, will be a popular person at Crypto Winter, which is going to be on the 13th and 14th of August at the Rendezvous Hotel in Queenstown. There's a few tickets remaining, so get in quick while you can. Any parting thoughts?
My parting thought is that it's okay if people disagree. The reality is I spoke to someone who will be nameless recently, Bryan, who very senior financial service person, and I sat across from at a dinner. It was potluck. And they said, reluctantly, what do you do? And I said, digital assets and crypto. And the first thing they said was, Bitcoin's a scam. And I said, okay, all right, let's start with that. Why is it a scam? And the answer was, it's too volatile. I said, okay, let's move downstream from that. What about stablecoins? I can see the use case. What about cross-border payments? I can see the use case. And what about cost out? I can see the use case. But Bitcoin's a scam. And so we just looped back to the same spot. And I thought, it's okay. And this is a very senior financial service figure in Australia. That was their position. They've made their mind up. And I'm okay with that. Much more comfortable than I once was. Express your view, see if it accords with other people. Try to take from what other people are doing, learn a little bit from it. And then and then move on. The reality is life is too short. So I'm looking forward to useful conversations when we catch up in a week or two.
Yeah, I wonder if 6 months from now that person has a little Bitcoin in a wallet somewhere stashed away.
Listen, you won't be surprised that he fit the demo. He's a middle-aged white guy who's been telling people for 3 decades in financial services he was right. So very very hard to break that habit. So I don't think he will, but he'll probably be a little bit closer to retirement, and he'll be fine.
Mate, look, it might be that it's the biggest scam of all time, but at 60% ROI year on year for the last decade, I'm buying that scam, mate.
Ignorance is bliss.
That's another conversation. So from my perspective, I love the space, and so I think there's lots of opportunities for lots of people in different ways, and pick your flavour. And one of the things I always say to people, I get a lot of people who speak about sort of moving into the space, and I say to them, what's your risk profile in the sense professionally? What risks are you willing to take? What investment risks are you willing to take? Personally, how are you placed? And then people very quickly sort of calibrate to where they are. And so each person needs to be sort of comfortable with their own ability to participate or otherwise in this sector.
Yeah, great.
Absolutely.
So my final thoughts are get connected. My experience so far, as little as it has been, and it's nothing like yours, Steve, but what I've learned is that, we're still in that moment in this industry where everybody's paddling together to try and make the whole boat go faster. There's pockets of competition starting to open up. There's pockets of sort of, commercial agendas floating through. But by and large, I've never been engaged with an industry where all of the market participants are really all trying to help each other go forward, even those that are competing head to head, because we all understand that this, we're only scratching the surface. What are we, less than 5% adoption so far, and that thing's moving. So my parting thoughts are, now's the opportunity. You can get to people like Steve. You can get to people like Jason Titman. You can have a conversation with these guys because, in a year or two when we're at 10 or 15% adoption, you're just not going to be able to. So that's my final thought. Bryan, anything?
Can I just jump in? There's one thing I need to say.
Yeah.
I love your wide-eyed optimism. I say to people often, when people say to me, a rising tide lifts all boats, I always say,
That's right.
you need a boat. That's who it falls over. So I'm the guy that sort of sits there and just notices that most people, they're bobbing in the water without the boat. So I like your optimistic approach.
I'll take a life jacket at this point in time.
Take a dinghy. For me, I think a lot of what Trevor's doing in New Zealand, what Steve's doing in Australia and around the world, and what I'm doing as vice chair of BlockchainNZ is we're helping to build the plumbing for a lot of the innovation that consumers will be benefiting from through digital assets. And as Steve mentioned as well, AI's, you can't look at digital assets in a vacuum. You have to look at all of the connective tissue like AI and other innovative technologies together. So I agree with Steve on that point. And my parting thought is your friend, that guy in financial services, I'd be worried about being the next Kodak, and I'd hate to be the CEO of the next Kodak in financial services where digital assets have just eaten their lunch and now they have a really awkward conversation with their shareholders and their board.
Yeah, and so if he hangs around long enough, he'll do that. Otherwise, I'm sure he'll go back to the 3 houses that he's managed to purchase in the last few years, and he'll be okay. But I appreciate the time, gents.
Yeah, you know what they say, Steve. You get the Bitcoin price you deserve. All right. On that note, I'll wrap it up. Pleasure to see you, buddy. Look forward to catching up, shaking your hand, and buying you a couple of beers next week in Queenstown. Bryan, always a pleasure, and we'll see you all. The next episode is Hogan Affairs. Thanks for joining in. See you later.
See you soon.